Near the river that slipped through the small city, mostly unwatched, slapping up against the red brick buildings as it had for centuries, there was a small second-hand camera shop. The shop was also close to a small bridge made of stone and apparently permanent. The river was quite narrow at this point, and the bridge's span was less than 40 feet. On one side of the bridge was the art school, a cloistered collection of fine old architecture which contained paint-spattered rooms with large windows, rooms which were clay-smeared and always dusty, and the mysterious dark rooms of the revered photography department, which had an altogether toxic feel about it. Its chemical smell barely contained by double doors which sealed out the light, the studios filled with clutter and lighting equipment and shabby backdrops. In the second-hand camera shop near the bridge, a conversation was taking place between the shop assistant and a customer. "I was asleep when the rumbling started," said the shop assistant, whose name was Oscar. "I started to wake up when the rumbling started, but it was like the noise was in my dream. Do you know that feeling?" "I sure do," replied the customer. The customer's name was Archie. He was sitting in one of 3 old chairs that were placed against the wall, perpendicular to the counter, behind which Oscar was standing, telling his story. The row of chairs just allowed enough room for the shop door to swing inwards. The counter was made of glass, and its 3 shelves were filled with cameras, the shop's second best stock. The best stock, the German Leicas and Rolleiflexes, the Swedish Hasselblads, were kept in glass cabinets behind where Oscar stood. Elsewhere, anywhere, on open shelves, piled in boxes loose underfoot, or stuffed in the window where all the other cameras and photography paraphernalia, a musty-smelling Coronet box camera from Britain, beautiful and tiny Voigtlanders from Austria, American Kodaks, Russian Feds, Zorkis and Lomos, Contax rangefinders. Small battered boxes, their peeling corners with sharpness long since lost, revealed ochre cardboard under the faded labels of forgotten manufacturers of light meters, darkroom equipment, and other inexplicable bits and bobs of photographic necessities for the particularly exacting photographer. Around Archie's neck was a Leica 3 camera that rested on his belly. It, like the cardboard boxes, had seen better days, but it was a fine camera with a lens of legendary sharpness and quality, a Scimitar 50mm f2. His voice had a rasping quality, if quality is the right word, what with it being simultaneously high-pitched and growly, halfway between an elongated wheeze and a gasp, wheezing on the exhale, gasping on the inhale. It was quite startling to the uninitiated and tended to make people in conversation with him feel out of breath themselves, but Oscar was well used to it. Archie dropped into the shop most mornings on his photo walks. He was, Oscar guessed, around 25 years old, but he might have been 40 years old. It was difficult to tell. There was something peculiarly ageless about Archie. It was like he'd been around forever because he had a savantish wisdom about him when it came to photography. But then he often seemed naive and unaware of things, like a boy yet to become a man. He always wore sunglasses, no matter the weather, even indoors, with small round lenses that were very dark. So Oscar had never seen his eyes. Occasionally he had glimpsed into the gap between the sunglasses and Archie's eyes, but hadn't been able to discern anything about his eyes. It was Oscar's guess that Archie was missing an eye, or one was somehow impaired. Probably the right one, because when Archie lifted his Leica to take a picture, often with one hand, Oscar had been slightly shocked by this casual technique at first, it was always to his left eye. Oscar, as part of his duties as the shop assistant, also processed Archie's films for him and made enlargements of certain negatives according to Archie's exacting instructions. Archie's negatives always produced pin-sharp prints. Despite his apparently slapdash approach to shooting, he was a master of the technical requirements of photography. Always the correct aperture for the distance of the subject from the lens. The distance of the subject nearly always perfectly judged, given that Archie specialized in street photography, stalking the streets on the lookout for faces and interactions, juxtapositions and relationships, things that happened and ceased happening in the same moment. You needed a preternatural, possibly even supernatural ability to gauge exactly when to press the shutter release with street photography. You had to predict the moment when the picture was about to be ready to be made. Archie's soft negs were very rare, and when they did appear, Archie would peer at them on the contact sheet and tut to himself. "Soft," he would wheeze and shake his head slightly while gasping. He sometimes had Oscar make large prints of the soft negatives, and he would spend some time looking at them in the shop, sometimes taping them onto one of the glass cases in which were stuffed dozens of old cameras awaiting new owners, so he could sit and take them in more comfortably. "I like how they get more out of focus the bigger you print them," he once said, but he preferred them to be sharp. So did Oscar. Experimental photography made him uncomfortable. He saw a lot of the work made by the art students, and a lot of it he didn't like too much. But this morning, Oscar wasn't worrying about the photography of the art students. He was telling Archie about what had happened earlier that morning. The noise became very loud very quickly, and the shaking, the bed shook. I thought perhaps I was having a medical episode of some sort. A fit, said Archie. Epilepsy, perhaps. Exactly, but no, it was a fucking hole, right? Oscar recoiled slightly at the language, but pressed on. The windows were rattling so violently I thought they might fall out of the house. Windows are the eyes of the house, said Archie, nodding wisely. That morning, Oscar had heard a noise so intense, so terrifyingly loud, and which had happened so unnaturally quickly, that there was no doubt something outlandish and terrible had taken place. The glass of water on Oscar's bedside table knocked against the lamp, a feeble reply to the sudden cacophony of breaking glass outside. A cup fell from the kitchenette sink. Oscar leapt out of bed and pulled the curtains to one side. From his attic window, the early morning light was feeble, and the moisture on the inside of the glass made it difficult to see what had made the awful noise. But Oscar knew already. The smell of ancient dust filled the air, creeping in through the gaps in the window. Oscar shivered involuntarily. He wiped the condensation with the side of his hand, and then dried his hand against his pyjama trousers, and through the distorting glass he saw a hole in the ground, huge and black and belching out plumes of dust, a vast maw that had just consumed an entire house across the street. He struggled with the window's elderly metal fitting and managed to shove it open. A gust entered the room, carrying brick dust with it. He could see people emerging from the houses next door to the one that had collapsed into the hole. "I say," Oscar shouted hesitatingly, "was there anyone in the house?" There were 3 or 4 people in the street, unsure whether to look into the hole or to get away, in case their houses should start to fall too. They milled around, the women tugging their dressing gowns tightly around themselves, with their hands to their cheeks. Their shocked faces pale. They didn't acknowledge him. Oscar started to cough. The dust was thick in the air, and then several pieces of floating debris hit him in the face, one of which lodged in his right eye. Choking and now unseeing, with his head down so as to avoid any further encounters with the dust cloud, he pulled the window closed. It wouldn't sit in its frame at first, so he had to yank it hard until the swollen old wood yielded and it thumped into place. Oscar rubbed his eyes so they cleared of the dust, though his sight was blurred and bleary with sleep and tears. He found his glasses on the bedside table, but putting them on, he realized that everything, including the glasses themselves, was covered with a layer of dust. The room smelled of soot and dust. He stood a while, in the center of the bedroom, unsure what to do. His heart was still beating loudly, his breathing was shallow, and his chest heaved with each breath. His hands were on his hips, bunched into fists. He had been awake less than a minute. He took off his glasses and wiped them with the corner of his pyjama top and decided to take a bath. As the water spluttered from the taps and the bathroom filled with steam, Oscar sat on the edge of the bath and reflected on what he had just seen, an entire house swallowed whole. He tried not to think about the fate of the people inside. He convinced himself they had had time to get out before the house had disappeared. This city is riddled with holes, he thought. The hundreds of abandoned chalk and flint mines unmapped were simply backfilled when they had been exhausted by the private, unaccountable companies which used to burrow under the ground. Some of the mines weren't even backfilled. The entrances were just closed and now were mostly hidden by dense growths of thorny bushes and scrappy woodland on the outskirts of the city. As a result of this long-gone industry, the earth is eating this city, this strange place, this misty, mysterious city, cleaved by the river that sluggishly rolls along, dragging weeds with it that look like they're straining to leave, those brown, sodden leaves reaching with every tendril for freedom, but with their roots too firmly embedded in the silty riverbed to escape. But this was the first house to go near where Oscar lived. We in this quarter smugly satisfied ourselves that we were safe from the old abandoned chalk mine workings, he thought to himself. That all happened over in the north of the city and the east, but not in the south and the west. Now sitting in the bath, 6 or 7 inches of rapidly cooling water barely covering his legs, Oscar suddenly felt very vulnerable. What if this house went down? His rooms were at the top of the old house. The idea of them falling all that way made him shiver and rush to get out of the bath and into some clothes. He left his attic room immediately and went straight to the camera shop, some sort of haven where he might tell someone what had happened. "A woman was calling for her cat to come in one night," wheezed Archie in the shop, "and the cat was running towards her. across the garden when suddenly the whole of the back garden just disappeared. It was like a neat line had been cut around it, like in one of those cartoons where someone saws through the floor from the room below. Down went the garden, taking the cat with it and the woman. Oscar had heard this story before and often wondered how the detail of the cat running across the garden had been witnessed and reported, given that the woman fell into the hole and was never seen again. The stories were often embellished, as if they needed to be made any more dramatic, Oscar thought, ruefully. He remembered, as everyone in the city did who was living there when it happened, the bus that was abruptly clawed into a chasm right next to the cathedral. 7 people failed to scrabble their way out of the bus before it plunged into a hole. Archie remembered it better than most because he had been on the bus and he had taken pictures of the whole episode. The images made his name and secured his career as a news photographer, but he wasn't proud of them. "I was taking pictures when I could have been helping people to get out," he once told Oscar when he had asked him about that day and the photographs he took. "Taking pictures isn't an honourable thing to do. Plus too many of them were fucking soft." The door of the shop opened suddenly. The bell juddered and jangled. The young woman stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. Her wide eyes flicked from Archie to Oscar. She attempted to swallow, but her gasping made it impossible. Oscar recognized her, a student from the art school, a regular customer. She spoke breathlessly. "There's a person lying on the ground," she managed, her hand pointing limply, vaguely gesturing the whereabouts. "I think she might be... It's a dead person. There's blood." Thanks.